As history fans, you should check out the Great Courses Plus podcast called Food, A Cultural Culinary History. This is not a Parcast podcast, but it is an interesting look at food throughout history.
Just search for Food, A Cultural Culinary History on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcast today.
The strongest reason for giving women a complete emancipation from all forms of bondage, of custom, dependence, superstition, from all the crippling influences of fear, is the solitude and personal responsibility of her own individual life. The strongest reason why we ask for a woman a voice in the government under which she lives is because of her birthright to self-sovereignty, because as an individual, she must rely on herself. She must make the voyage of life alone. To guide our own craft, we must be captain, pilot, engineer, with chart and compass to stand at the wheel, to watch the winds and waves and know when to take in the sail, and to read the signs in the firmament over all. It matters not whether the solitary voyager is man or woman. Nature, having endowed them equally, leaves them to their own skill and judgment in the hour of danger, and, if not equal to the occasion, alike they perish. Hi, I'm Vanessa Richardson.
And I'm Carter Roy. Welcome to Historical Figures. Every Wednesday, we discuss a different person's lasting historical impact, unique personality, and impression on the world around them.
Our audio biographies cover big lives, but we like to focus on little-known facts. If you want to listen to any previous episodes, you can find them on your favorite podcast directory. And while you're there, we'd really appreciate it if you could leave a 5-star review. Today, we're diving into the life of women's rights activist and suffragist Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Oh, I thought you were going to say Susan B. Anthony.
Well, she's the one everyone knows, but really, Susan and Elizabeth were a team. Susan's strength was in organizing, whereas Elizabeth's was in developing the philosophy of the movement. Their friendship and partnership lasted over 50 years.
Elizabeth helped define the early goals and tenor of the women's rights movement in America, for good and for ill. She's directly responsible for women gaining the vote, but she's also credited with starting a movement that focused narrowly on the concerns of white middle-class women to the exclusion of others.
Her legacy is definitely both complicated and controversial, but so was her life. So let's get started. Elizabeth Cady was born on November 12, 1815, to Daniel Cady and Margaret Livingston Cady in Jonestown, New York.
Margaret was the daughter of Revolutionary War hero Colonel James Livingston, and the Livingstons boasted connections to the old Dutch aristocracy of New York. Margaret was tall, headstrong, and an expert rider.
Daniel had a quieter background. He farmed with his father in Canaan, New York, before becoming apprenticed to a shoemaker. That ended when a cobbling accident left him blind in one eye.
After that, he taught at a school and studied law before moving to Johnstown in 1799, where he met Margaret.
They were married in 1801, when Margaret was 16 and Daniel was 28.
Daniel began working as an attorney for Margaret's brother-in-law, Peter Smith, a partner in the lucrative fur trading business. Daniel eventually began to advise Smith on real estate as well.
Daniel used the money he made from his work with Smith to invest in New York real estate until he slowly became one of the wealthiest landowners in the state.
In 1804, the Cady's first child, Tryphena, was born. They eventually had 11 kids, 5 boys and 6 girls, but only 5 girls and 1 boy would survive to adulthood.
Daniel was a Little C conservative man, a staunch Federalist. He was elected to the state legislature in 1808, then to Congress in 1814 for a 2-year term. That same year, 2 of the Cady's sons died.
It was at this point in the Cady family story that Elizabeth, the seventh child and their third daughter was born.
She was raised in upper-class luxury in a household with 12 servants and 2 permissive parents who were happy for her to learn and explore as she liked.
In later years, Elizabeth didn't write much about her mother except to say that Margaret was a queenly presence and that she acted as the household disciplinarian.
It was her father who Elizabeth most keenly loved and admired. She would sit in Daniel's office as law students and young lawyers clerked with him.
Wow, that's pretty open-minded of him.
It certainly wasn't the kind of education that was open to all little girls at the time, that's for sure. But Daniel Cady would never be an advocate for wider women's rights, with one big exception. And it's one that's crucial to Elizabeth's early understanding of the issue.
Only one of the Cady's sons made it to adulthood. Eleazar, born in 1806, was the apple of his father's eye, all the more so because he was the only remaining son.
He graduated from Union College in 1826 when he was 20 years old, but within a few weeks of graduation, he became gravely ill. He died, leaving his parents and 5 sisters to mourn him.
Elizabeth was 11.
Elizabeth said, quote, "I still recall going into the large, darkened parlor to see my brother and finding the casket, mirrors, and pictures all draped in white, and my father seated by his side, pale and immovable. At length, my father heaved a sigh and said, 'Oh, my daughter, I wish you were a boy.' Throwing my arms about his neck, I replied, 'I will try to be all my brother was.'" End quote. It is this moment that Elizabeth, writing much later, credited for her earliest understanding of the differences between the lives of men and the lives of women.
She believed that her father's lamentation proved that he valued his single son more heavily than he valued any of his 5 daughters. But it's also possible that Daniel Cady knew that, bright as she was, Elizabeth's talents would never be able to be as fully recognized or realized in this time period because she was a woman.
At this time in New York State, married women could not sign a contract, own or inherit property, or have control over their own wages. All of this fell under the purview of the married woman's husband.
Wow, why would women even want to get married?
I mean, there weren't a ton of other choices. Women, when they worked, were routinely paid less than their male counterparts, and that's assuming that they got the same caliber of jobs. Remember, women weren't accepted in colleges and universities at the time, and they paid taxes on their lesser wages, but women weren't allowed to vote, so they had no say in how their taxes were spent.
That sounds like exactly what the Revolutionary War was fought over. Taxation without representation.
It is.
Okay, so single life and married life were both bad options. I'm assuming divorce wasn't looked upon favorably either.
Ding ding, we have a winner. Women were not able to divorce their husbands for anything other than adultery, and should they receive a divorce, they were never granted custody over their children. Children were treated as property, which of course belonged to the husband.
So, getting back to the Cady family, which now had 5 daughters and no sons.
It meant that Daniel Cady's daughters, when they married, had no control over any inheritance that they would get from their father. Legally speaking, all of his money and property would belong to men who were not his kin, which is why this was the one and only women's rights issue that mattered to Daniel Cady.
But it mattered to Elizabeth as well. Around this time, a woman named Flora Campbell came to Daniel Cady's law office with a problem. She had bought her family's farm with her own money, but when her husband died, he willed the farm to their son. He didn't take care of the farm, and he treated his mother cruelly.
Daniel said that, according to the law, there was nothing that could be done because the property wasn't hers, even if it was bought with the money she had earned.
Elizabeth got so angry about the unfairness in the legal system that she threatened to cut the offending laws out of Daniel's law books. Daniel had to explain to her that that wasn't how laws worked.
Even if she cut the laws out of his books, they would still exist. Though it wasn't the lesson Daniel Cady intended, it was the beginning of Elizabeth's education in how the legal system worked and how best to petition for change.
Elizabeth was able to further her education with the help of other male role models in her life. The next-door neighbor, Reverend Simon Hossack, tutored Elizabeth in Greek and math and taught her how to play chess.
Her sister Tryphaena's husband, Edward Bayard, taught Elizabeth philosophy and how to ride a horse, and the clerks in her father's office challenged her to debate.
Elizabeth, at this point, really seems to have taken her promise to her father to heart. She wanted to be the son he didn't have, and competed with men at their intellectual level to prove her own worth.
But when she came in second place at the Johnstown Academy Greek competition, her father repeated his "I wish you were a boy" refrain. Elizabeth felt as though she wasn't enough, that her intellect would never outweigh her gender with her father. Elizabeth said, quote, "To think that all in me of which my father would have felt a proper pride had I been a man is deeply mortifying to him because I am a woman." End quote. Elizabeth attended the coeducational Johnstown Academy until 1830. She had always been at the top of her class, and she wanted to go on to college.
But there were no colleges in the United States that admitted women, and Daniel Cady wasn't interested in Elizabeth's continued education.
With the help of Edward Bayard, Elizabeth finally convinced him to send her to the Troy Female Seminary in 1831, when she was 15 years old.
The founder of the school, Emma Willard, wasn't interested in creating a finishing school. She was the first female educator to offer a course load for women that was on par with the educational rigor that men's colleges offered.
And she wrote the majority of the textbooks that were used in her classrooms. Here, finally, was a female role model that Elizabeth could learn from.
Or, rather, one that she could have learned from. Elizabeth preferred to be in the world of men, and saw her time at an all-girls school as beneath her. She didn't like the pretensions and petty jealousies of the other girls.
So wait, Elizabeth Cady didn't like other women?
Well, it's more nuanced than that, but a lot of Elizabeth's initial interest in women's rights came less from how she viewed the plight of her fellow woman, and more from her own pain at being excluded from the sort of life she felt was hers by right to pursue.
It was during this same year of 1831 that Elizabeth had her first brush with theological disillusionment.
So we pray, our Father.
She and many of her classmates went to hear preachers during the Great Troy Revival, which was an attempt to bring young people back to the church.
The revivalists preached Protestantism, minus the idea of predetermination. They said that it was the choices you made on earth that would determine whether or not you got into heaven, not whether you'd been singled out as one of the chosen from the very beginning.
Elizabeth was enthusiastic, attending sermons for 6 weeks before converting. But conversion didn't sit well with her, and the fear of judgment by God overwhelmed her so much that she went home ill.
Her father and Edward Bayard both worked to get her spirits back up through logic, science, and reason.
Bayard literally assigned her books to read. Worst summer vacation ever.
But it worked. Elizabeth began to feel herself again and would forevermore question religious authority.
She went back to school and graduated in 1833, with no big plans for her future. She spent much of the 1830s partying at balls and making the rounds to visit her relatives.
There was a family rumor that in 1838, Edward Bayard, Elizabeth's brother-in-law and one-time teacher, confessed his love for her and asked her to run away with him.
She didn't, but after 1838, Elizabeth found herself drawn more to her cousin Gerrit Smith's home. Gerrit was the son of fur trader Peter Smith, Daniel Cady's best client in those early years of his marriage to Margaret.
He was one of the wealthiest men in the country, owning land in all but 6 counties in New York State. Gerrit and his wife were both invested in the revivalist movement and dedicated themselves to acts of benevolence.
He became one of the leaders of the abolitionist movement, and their home served as a who's who of the movement in New York. With Daniel Cady's conservative outlook dominating her childhood, this was Elizabeth's first look at radicalization.
And she liked what she saw. Not that Elizabeth became an abolitionist at the time, but she loved being surrounded by people with radical thoughts and ideas.
It was at her cousin Gerrit's house that Elizabeth met Henry Brewster Stanton in 1839.
Henry was a celebrated speaker and lecturer in the abolitionist community, renowned for the strength of his rhetoric and delivery, though he had recently had a public break with his mentor, William Lloyd Garrison, over the issue of women's voting rights within the abolitionist societies.
Let me guess. Henry was for them, Garrison against?
Guess again.
Oh, wow. Well, that probably won't cause any problems in the future.
Within a month, Henry and Elizabeth were engaged to be married, briefly.
Elizabeth's parents didn't approve of the match, or of Henry, or of his choice of occupation. In their eyes, he was a professional radical troublemaker who would never be able to provide for their daughter.
So they broke off the engagement, briefly.
Elizabeth learned that Henry would be leaving to go to England for 8 months for an anti-slavery convention, and she wanted to go with him.
It was a huge financial strain on Henry to come up with the money for the 2 tickets across the Atlantic. He was owed 2 years of wages, not to mention several of his friends hadn't paid back money he had loaned them.
But he managed to scrape together the fare for 2. And so, on May 1st, 1840, in secret, Henry and Elizabeth were married. He was 35 and she was 24.
Elizabeth had the priest omit the word obey from her vows, which was traditionally used to press women into having sexual relations with their husbands when they did not want to.
Well, nowadays, we refer to it as marital rape, and not only is that no longer encouraged, but it is an actual crime. It's been illegal in New York State, Elizabeth's home, since 1984.
So that's 144 years after Elizabeth refused to say obey in her vows, and only 34 years before today. That's depressing.
Yeah, but that's progress. And speaking of progress, Elizabeth also refused to drop her maiden name, as was the custom of married women at the time. She didn't believe in making her identity entirely dependent on her husband.
So Elizabeth Cady became Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Here's something we want to share with you.
We spend a third of our lives sleeping. Shouldn't we spend that time being comfortable? I think so, which is why I sleep on a Casper mattress every night. Casper is a sleep brand creating an exceptionally comfortable sleep experience, one night at a time. Each of their 3 mattress models are designed to cradle your natural geometry.
There is nothing worse than waking up in the middle of the night sweating or shivering. I love Casper's breathable design, which helps regulate my body temperature and keep me comfortable all night long.
It's delivered to your door in a box small enough to carry upstairs or fit in an elevator. I was impressed with how easy it was to get from my front door to my bedroom.
Plus, you can be sure of your purchase thanks to Casper's 100-night risk-free Sleep On It trial, plus free shipping and returns to the U.S. and Canada.
Get $50 towards select mattresses by visiting casper.com/figures and using figures at checkout. That's casper.com/figures. Offer code FIGURES, FIGURES, for $50 off your mattress purchase. Terms and conditions apply.
I'm excited to get home tonight, jump into bed, and watch the premiere of Hulu's new original series, The Looming Tower.
This new limited series is based on the Pulitzer Prize-winning book by journalist Lawrence Wright. The book was a page-turner, and I'm looking forward to seeing it on screen.
The show traces the rising threat of Osama bin Laden and how the rivalry between the FBI and CIA may have set a path for the tragedy of 9/11. The show takes a look at the real stories of real people involved in a tragic event. As fans of the stories we tell about icons in history, you won't want to miss The Looming Tower.
From the star-studded cast to the incredible visuals, this series is the show all of us at Parcast have been talking about.
Starring Emmy winner Jeff Daniels, Golden Globe nominee Peter Sarsgaard, and Tahar Rahim as Ali Soufan, The Looming Tower premieres February 28th, only on Hulu.
Now, let's get back to the story.
The newly wedded Stantons went off on their 8-month honeymoon on May 12th, boarding a ship bound for London. It was a 3-week trip, and Henry used the time to educate his new wife Elizabeth on the goings-on in the abolition and anti-slavery movements.
He wanted her to have a good understanding of the topics that were on the table for the first ever World's Anti-Slavery Convention. That included where he stood on the issue of women in the movement.
As we mentioned earlier, Henry didn't think women should be voting in the meetings, but he did believe that women had a place within the movement.
Unfortunately, the London Convention begged to differ. On June 12th, the British delegates refused the proposal put forth by the Garrisonian delegates.
That's the pro-women side, the one that believed women should have a full voice in the abolitionist community.
And the convention refused to accept the female delegates from America. They were allowed to sit in on the meetings, but that was it. And that was considered a groundbreaking concession at the time.
Elizabeth was miffed. Why shouldn't women, who were some of the first and most prominent abolitionists, be allowed to speak about oppression and freedom? It wasn't fair, and it was ridiculous to exclude people who had something to contribute.
But she wasn't going to let that ruin her trip. Instead, she began socializing with the distinguished yet excluded female abolitionists, notably Lucretia Mott. Elizabeth said, quote, "Mrs. Mott was to me an entire new revelation of womanhood."
Lucretia Mott was a Quaker woman about 20 years older than Elizabeth, who took the convention's decision about women in stride. For her, it was enough that it had been discussed. That meant that people would continue discussing and debating it long after the convention was over.
She provided a look at what kind of life a radical woman could expect. The first female role model Elizabeth chose to accept into her life. She was a feminist, an abolitionist, a mother, a preacher. She refused to live a life of quiet subservience. Elizabeth said, quote, "Mrs. Mott and I resolved to hold a convention as soon as we returned home and to form a society to advocate the rights of women," end quote. The convention didn't come to any great conclusions, and the Stantons spent the rest of their trip touring through the British Isles. They returned to the States in December of 1840.
After a few months touring to see friends and family, the Stantons settled in Johnstown in the Cady home. Henry decided to study law with Elizabeth's father, which annoyed many of his abolitionist friends. They thought he was selling out.
But after a couple of years of study, Henry passed the Massachusetts bar in 1842 and moved his little family up to Boston.
That family now included their first child, Daniel, nicknamed Neil, who had been born earlier that year while Henry was away on anti-slavery business. He was never present for the births of any of his children.
Part of this was because he and Elizabeth spent a lot of time apart. She moved back to one of her father's houses in Albany while her Boston house was being prepared, where she gave birth to her second son, Henry, nicknamed Kit, in 1844.
Her father's homes were comfortable, upper class, what Elizabeth had grown used to. Henry wasn't well off and couldn't offer that life to Elizabeth.
But while he wrote her fervid letters of admiration, Elizabeth doesn't appear to have written Henry as often because she was content with her life. She enjoyed motherhood, and she lobbied, with her father's permission of course, for the New York Married Women's Property Act.
This would allow women to maintain their own property separate from that of their husbands, which both Elizabeth and her father advocated, especially since he disapproved of Henry. The law eventually passed in 1848.
Once the house was finished, Elizabeth and her two children moved back to Boston with Henry in July of 1844. She enjoyed the city life and motherhood and prospered, giving birth to her third son, Garrett, nicknamed Gat, in 1845.
But Henry didn't like Boston. His political life wasn't going as well as he had expected, and he had problems with chronic congestion in the city. So, in 1847, the Stantons left Boston for a house Daniel Cady had gifted Elizabeth in Seneca Falls, New York.
Seneca Falls? I think I've heard of it before.
It rings a bell because of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. It's considered the birthplace of the women's rights movement in the United States.
But those conversations were already happening, weren't they?
Of course, it's a simplification of the movement's beginnings, but Seneca Falls does represent the first time a wider meeting was called specifically to address the issue of women's rights, not connecting it to another movement or organization.
On July 9th, 1848, Elizabeth joined a small get-together of a few Quakers in Waterloo, New York, at Lucretia Mott's request. Lucretia wasn't there herself, but she knew the other attendees and wanted them to become acquainted with Elizabeth.
Elizabeth had just endured a year of seclusion from the bustle of city life and city friends, and with the management of the household and the children falling completely to her in Henry's long absences, she was ready to complain.
Elizabeth said, quote, "The general discontent I felt with woman's portion as wife, mother, housekeeper, physician, and spiritual guide, the chaotic conditions into which everything fell without her constant supervision, and the wearied, anxious look of the majority of women impressed me with a strong feeling that some active measures should be taken to remedy the wrongs of society in general, and women in particular."
The group decided to place a call in the paper for a conference about women's issues and rights that would take place 2 weeks later. This conference later became famously known as the Seneca Falls Convention.
In the meantime, Elizabeth and one of her new Quaker friends, Lizzie McClintock, agreed to meet ahead of time to hammer out some declarations.
This took the form of a Declaration of Rights and Sentiments that drew heavily from the American Declaration of Independence.
Elizabeth said, quote, "The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her."
They went on to list 18 grievances, including, at Elizabeth's behest, the right for women to vote.
Other women, including Lucretia Mott, disagreed with Elizabeth's inclusion of suffrage, fearing that they were pushing too far and would be mocked.
But the entirety of the declaration was submitted to the 300-person Seneca Falls Convention, and 100 of them signed their names to it.
68 of the signers were women, 32 were men.
Most newspapers mocked and disparaged the demand for suffrage. However, Frederick Douglass, who had spoken at the conference, wrote in the North Star that he thought it was a completely reasonable demand.
But no matter what anyone else thought about the idea of women's suffrage, Elizabeth considered the conference a huge personal success. Elizabeth said, quote, "The opportunity of expressing myself fully and freely on a subject I felt so deeply about came as a great relief."
But for a number of years, the buck stopped there. Elizabeth couldn't go to many conferences, especially not ones that were held too far from her home.
She remained a housewife and a young mother, after all, and she actually loved motherhood and running her own home in these early years, even through her complaints.
When Daniel Cady had gifted Elizabeth the house in Seneca Falls, he issued her a challenge to fix it up, and she took it with relish. She was very proud of her home.
And of her children. She enjoyed rearing them and gave them freedom to do as they liked that other mothers of the time were shocked by. And while the boys were, by all accounts, troublemakers at a young age, most of them grew up to be fine men.
But that's where Elizabeth's attention was for most of the 1850s. So throughout that decade, Lucretia Mott, not Elizabeth, was considered the leader of the movement.
Lucretia was helped by a young woman named Lucy Stone. 3 years younger than Elizabeth, Lucy was the first woman from Massachusetts to obtain a college degree.
She was also one of the first women of the era to not take her husband's name at all when she married in 1854. She remained Lucy Stone from the day she was born to the day she died.
Lucy had been involved in abolition and in women's rights since the 1830s, and in 1850, she helped organize the first National Women's Rights Convention.
Meanwhile, Elizabeth made her contribution by reading the newspapers, developing her ideas, and writing letters and articles to be printed in newspapers or read at national meetings.
Her first article was published in a temperance magazine by her neighbor, Amelia Bloomer. Elizabeth wrote under the pen name Sunflower, an endearment from Henry early in their relationship.
Perhaps this was inspired by Henry's long stay at home in 1849. He was home for over half of the year, longer than any time that the Stantons had been together, and Elizabeth felt happy with her domestic life.
And then Henry was elected to the state senate for a 2-year term, leaving Elizabeth at home with their 3 boys.
Soon to be 4. Elizabeth had to decline going to the convention Lucy Stone had organized in Boston in 1850 because she was too pregnant to travel. Her 4th son, Theodore, was born in 1851.
And her 3 older boys were very active. It's no small wonder that Elizabeth started wearing the Bloomer costume in 1851.
The Bloomer costume consisted of a short dress with loose pants worn beneath it. It was considered more hygienic, easier to move around in for housework, and safer for chasing down young troublemaking children.
But there was also plenty of talk about how scandalous it was for women to show that they had legs under those dresses.
Elizabeth seemed to welcome the notoriety, and soon dress reform became a key topic in her feminist agenda.
In fact, she was wearing bloomers when she first met the woman who became her greatest friend and ally, Susan B. Anthony.
Susan was an unmarried 30-year-old Quaker woman, 5 years younger than Elizabeth, and she was interested in temperance and abolition.
It didn't take Elizabeth long to realize that Susan would make for an excellent recruit in her crusade for women's rights, and she asked Susan to stay with her before attending a local temperance convention. Elizabeth said, quote, "I am afraid I cannot attend it. I have so much care with all these boys on my hands, but I will write a letter. How much I do long to be free from housekeeping and children so as to have some time to read and think and write." End quote. In Susan, Elizabeth found the perfect person to go forth and speak for women's rights. Because Susan wasn't tied to a husband or children, she had freedom that Elizabeth lacked.
Susan would often read the letters and missives that Elizabeth wrote for the conventions in the 1850s. And eventually she demanded ever more speeches from Elizabeth because she knew firsthand the impact that Elizabeth's words had.
Elizabeth said, quote, "I forged the thunderbolts. Susan fired them." And Susan inspired Elizabeth to get more active in her public role. She made the trip out to a women's temperance convention organized by Susan in 1852 while pregnant with her 5th child and wearing bloomers.
The Women's State Temperance Society named Elizabeth president and Susan secretary. This was Elizabeth's first official leadership role, and she used her time at the podium to remake the society in her feminist image.
After all, if women were put at risk by their drunkard husbands, what better reason to fight for women's equal protection under the law?
Elizabeth's 5th child, a daughter named Margaret, was born late in 1852. She celebrated giving birth to a champion of the cause and declared that this would be her last child.
For which Susan was grateful. She was ready for Elizabeth to be going on the road with her and fighting for the cause.
And Elizabeth was ready for that too. Her lonely domestic life in sleepy Seneca Falls was beginning to bore her again.
Elizabeth said, quote, "I am at the boiling point. I shall die of intellectual repression, a woman's rights convulsion." End quote. She would get her chance to break free of her intellectual repression when she was asked to speak before the New York Senate on women's issues in 1854.
Elizabeth summoned Susan to help watch the children and research legal precedent that would allow her to make her arguments. She even rehearsed her speech in front of her father, now a judge for the state Supreme Court.
Elizabeth wrote later that Daniel Cady was moved to tears by her speech, but other accounts have him bribing or threatening her with disinheritance to keep her off the Senate floor.
But she delivered her address to the state Senate in February 1854, arguing that women shouldn't occupy a legal status that was inferior to men.
And it cemented her as a key figure in the fight. She was asked to fill a larger public role by the women who admired her, but Henry and her father's disapproval kept her from making additional public addresses for another 6 years.
Henry didn't like that she was speaking out against oppression? Wasn't that his bread and butter back when they met?
Yep, but there was a key difference. Henry wasn't a woman.
It always comes back to that.
And Elizabeth had a good excuse for staying home. Yet another baby. Harriet was born in 1856, the 6th of Henry and Elizabeth's children.
Elizabeth was 40, while her other children were 13, 11, 10, 4, and 2. This baby was the last baby, she promised.
And Henry was launching more doomed political campaigns. He tried to veer Democrat, but they didn't trust him because of his earlier abolitionist career. Susan continued to demand that Elizabeth write more speeches, and Elizabeth only acquiesced when Susan agreed to watch the children while she wrote.
Finally, in 1858, Elizabeth agreed to go to a meeting at the Philadelphia Friends with Lucretia Mott, but at the last minute, her trunk was lost and she refused to go.
Seriously? After 4 years of staying at home, that was her best excuse?
Well, no, it actually wasn't. She was pregnant.
Again? Ouch.
This one was actually the last one. It wasn't an easy pregnancy, but Elizabeth didn't want to give that excuse because she didn't want to further any thoughts that women and men had different physical capabilities. So she kept it quiet and blamed it on a missing trunk.
Wow. Okay, that's a better excuse than I gave it credit for.
Baby Robert was born in 1859 when Elizabeth was 43.
For the first time, childbirth left her exhausted and depressed. To add to her woes, Judge Daniel Cady died in October of the same year. Elizabeth was inconsolable.
And her beloved cousin Garrett committed himself to an insane asylum after John Brown's failed raid on Harper's Ferry. John Brown had tried to take over an arsenal with the goal of arming slaves for a revolt.
Garrett, one of the wealthiest men in the country and a staunch abolitionist, had helped finance John Brown's raid. The aftermath of the attempted raid, including the hanging of John Brown, caused Garrett to have a temporary mental breakdown.
The only bright spot in Elizabeth's life during these dark times was Susan, who helped her get back to her old self by working and writing and furthering the cause again.
And Elizabeth's inheritance gave her a sense of financial independence, one not predicated on Henry's stop-and-go stream of income.
With her youngest weaned and her drive to be active in the activist community returning, 1860 saw Elizabeth give 3 speeches that outlined her feminist agenda at the time.
The first was to the New York legislature about an expansion of the Married Women's Property Act. Elizabeth used the opportunity to speak about the necessity of giving women the vote in order to protect their legal interests.
She compared women to slaves and asked that women be treated more like the citizens that they are.
Eesh, and this in a time when there was actual slavery and actual enslaved women. How did her abolitionist friends take that?
They were willing to go along with the metaphor this time around because they did believe that women deserved a voice in government.
The next speech was to the American Anti-Slavery Society about the necessity of securing the vote for all women, regardless of race.
And that was followed up just a couple days later with a speech about divorce to the National Women's Rights Convention.
Marriage was seen by most people as a sacrament, a covenant between two people in the name of God.
But Elizabeth realized that there were legal ramifications to marriage, and therefore marriage should be defined not as a sacrament, but as a legal agreement.
A contract, in other words, and contracts were made between people, human beings, not divine beings.
She believed that marriage was, therefore, a fallible human institution that was unfair to women.
Elizabeth said, quote, "A man marrying gives up no rights, but a woman, every right. So long as our present false marriage relation continues, which in most cases is nothing more or less than legalized prostitution, women can have no self-respect, and of course, man will have none for her." End quote.
It didn't go over so well at the convention. People voted to have the entire speech struck from the record, though a compromise was reached where the discussion was merely tabled.
And the press wasn't kind to Elizabeth or her views either.
But luckily, she was overshadowed by Abraham Lincoln's election as the Republican presidential candidate.
Henry, by this point, had switched parties to join the Republicans. He had stumped for another candidate, but threw himself into Lincoln's campaign after he secured the nomination.
Elizabeth, meanwhile, went on an abolitionist speaking tour organized by Susan in 1861. They were met by angry mobs who didn't want a war over slavery to tear the Union apart.
But it did. The American Civil War started in April of 1861.
In August of 1861, a few months after the beginning of the Civil War, Henry was given a minor treasury position, the deputy collector at Port Authority, and moved his family from Seneca Falls to New York City in 1862. Elizabeth was glad for the change of scenery.
But the war put her plans for the women's rights movement on hold, as everyone in her radical circle pitched in for the war effort and collectively pushed for abolition.
Which, to be honest, people weren't expecting. Lincoln was still viewed as a man who valued keeping the Union together more than he valued freedom for the slaves.
Elizabeth believed that women aiding the war effort could only help the cause, that they would be rewarded for their work with full citizenship and suffrage.
In the meantime, Elizabeth's second oldest son, 17-year-old Kit, joined the Union Army, and her eldest, Neil, at age 20, went to work as a clerk with his father at the collections office.
After Lincoln put out the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, the abolitionists wanted to push Lincoln even further.
Susan and Elizabeth decided that they would collect 3 million signatures, demanding that the slaves all be set free in a 13th Amendment to the Constitution.
Elizabeth said, quote, "There never can be a true peace in this republic until the civil and political rights of all citizens of African descent and all women are practically established." End quote. At the time, she believed that universal suffrage was the only way to move forward, out of the war and into the future.
By August 1864, the petitions had garnered 400,000 signatures, which were used by allies in Congress to push through the 13th Amendment in 1865.
But by that time, Elizabeth was dealing with some family scandals.
Neil, the Stantons' eldest son, had accepted bribes and forged Henry's signature on legal documents at the port in 1863.
Henry was implicated in the ensuing investigation, and he was forced to resign in December of that year, even after Neil had admitted he had been the one to do wrong and returned the bonds.
But it negatively impacted Elizabeth's relationship with Henry.
Neil was Elizabeth's favorite child, and she refused to believe that he had done anything wrong, so her blame fell on Henry, and he resented her for that.
Henry became a reporter, first for the New York Tribune and later the New York Sun. His and Elizabeth's lives were spent more and more apart from one another, which, frankly, neither of them seemed to mind.
Neal later found work as an election supervisor in Louisiana, by which I mean Henry secured work for him by promising Louisiana's governor that Henry's paper wouldn't publish anything bad about him.
And he was Elizabeth's favorite. Why?
I can only speculate, but it might have something to do with the tragedies of her brother's deaths early in her life, and with her father's clear preference for her oldest brother, Eleazar. She may have seen something of Eleazar in Neal, whether it was just because they were both the eldest male child of their family, or that they were the first son to make it to adulthood.
But let's go back to the passing of the 13th Amendment. There were some abolitionists who felt that their work was done.
Elizabeth and many others, including Frederick Douglass, felt that was naive. They believed that their work wasn't over until black people were fully enfranchised and given a voice in government.
Obviously, Elizabeth didn't think that they should stop here. She believed in universal enfranchisement and believed that the right for women to vote was equally important.
But not everyone seconded that opinion. There were plenty of active abolitionists who believed that women were a secondary concern and that it was vitally important to enfranchise black men now to ensure the safety of the black community. Elizabeth disagreed.
Eventually, in 1866, after the war was over, the text of a new proposed amendment began to float around, and women's rights activists saw cause for alarm.
The amendment defines citizenship and penalizes states that deny citizens the right to vote for any reason, barring criminal acts.
Well, for the most part.
The intention was to push states toward allowing black men the vote. Any eligible male citizens who were denied the vote wouldn't be counted when tallying up how many representatives a state could have in Congress.
But the insertion of the word male to describe citizens horrified Elizabeth and Susan. This was the first time the word male had been used in the entire text of the Constitution or its amendments, and Elizabeth feared it would be used to continue to deny women the right to vote.
So Susan and Elizabeth did what they had done before and sent out a series of petitions, this time demanding an amendment that made it impossible to deny a citizen the right to vote based on their gender.
But this time, they only received 10,000 signatures, a far cry from the 400,000 that had showed support for abolition.
They appealed to the Republicans and then to the Democrats, but no one wanted to listen. The 14th Amendment passed.
So Elizabeth decided to take matters into her own hands. She realized that while women weren't allowed to vote, nothing kept them from running for office.
So she announced herself as an independent candidate for Congress in 1866, with universal suffrage as the crown jewel of her plank.
She received 24 votes.
If only women could have voted, perhaps it would have been a better performance.
Yes. Susan and Elizabeth spent 1866 and 1867 fighting for women's suffrage, culminating in an appearance before the Suffrage Subcommittee of New York State.
They failed, and the subcommittee recommended universal male suffrage.
But late in 1867, Kansas had two state amendments that voters could choose between. One would allow black men the vote, the other would allow women the vote.
These were not exclusionary. Both of them could have passed.
But the Republicans and most of the abolitionists made the first their priority, leaving Elizabeth and Susan to deal with the second on their own.
In order to finance their trip and speeches in Kansas, they turned to notable wealthy racist George Francis Train.
This is the part of the story where some of Elizabeth's language and positions become incredibly racist and xenophobic. There's going to be some uncomfortable and offensive quotes from her, which we're choosing to include because we don't want to gloss over this part of her story. It is important to note this does not reflect Parcast's views, my views, or Vanessa's views in any way.
George Train was interested in suffrage for white women, not so much for black people.
He advocated for, quote, educated suffrage, and it was a term Elizabeth felt described her disappointments with the interest in enfranchising black men over white, educated, moneyed women like herself.
Susan and Elizabeth's abolitionist friends couldn't believe the awful company they chose to keep, and all but abandoned them.
But Susan and Elizabeth weren't deterred, and they continued to stomp for women's suffrage in Kansas.
In the end, neither amendment passed in Kansas.
Elizabeth was disappointed, but had something new to look forward to. Her new friend, George Train, had promised that he would finance a newspaper, one that she would run.
She named it Revolution, and its motto was, "Men their rights and nothing more, women their rights and nothing less."
The first issue was published in 1868, with the first 4 pages devoted to Stanton's articles and editorials about women, and the last 2 pages devoted to George Train's pet causes.
Elizabeth liked to print the outraged responses from former friends in the abolitionist and reform communities, along with her own scathing responses.
One of the popular topics of conversation in the paper, as well as in the abolitionist community at large, was that of the 15th Amendment.
Quote, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude."
Notice what it doesn't mention: gender.
Elizabeth and Susan refused to support an amendment that enfranchised black men but did not enfranchise women. And in her attempts to make her arguments for why women deserve the vote, Elizabeth began to make arguments against universal male suffrage.
What was her argument?
She positioned herself and other white women as being morally and intellectually superior to different types of men, specifically foreign-born or black men. Elizabeth said, quote, "The best interests of the nation demand that we outweigh this incoming pauperism, ignorance, and degradation with the wealth, education, and refinement of the women of the Republic." End quote. To be clear, yes, Elizabeth Cady Stanton is referring to black men, specifically freed slaves, as poor, unintelligent, and uncultured.
Horrible. And to think she was an abolitionist just a few short years earlier, making the case for why black women deserve to vote.
Actually, she still wanted black women to be enfranchised, but she couched it in some pretty racist language that denigrated black men. Elizabeth said, quote, "It is better for black women to be the slave of an educated white man than of a degraded, ignorant black one." End quote.
How did she change her views so drastically?
Elizabeth had drawn her line in the sand. She was for women and only women.
She and Susan held a convention in Washington in 1869 where they adopted the demand for a 16th Amendment that would enfranchise women. Frederick Douglass, since the Seneca Falls Convention, had supported women's enfranchisement enthusiastically, and he continued to support the idea now. But he was disappointed by the harmful rhetoric his former friend Elizabeth was now adopting in her efforts to make that demand a reality.
His view was that women's right to vote, while important, wasn't as pressing an issue as black men's right to vote. Black men and women's safety was on the line, and their enfranchisement was the only thing that could help them protect themselves.
Douglass said when women, because they are women, are dragged from their homes and hung up on lampposts, then they will have the urgency to obtain the ballot.
After the Washington Convention, Elizabeth and Susan went off on a tour of the Midwest, hoping to recruit more women to the cause, preferably ones without ties to the abolitionist movement.
At the next meeting of the American Equal Rights Association later in 1869, the New England delegates led a walkout over Elizabeth's controversial views. Elizabeth took this as a sign that the organization would never make women's rights a priority.
So she invited the female delegates to join a new organization, the National Women's Suffrage Association, to be comprised of only female members.
The New England activists who had been disgusted by Elizabeth's racial prejudices established the competing American Women's Suffrage Association that same year. They began publishing a journal, the Woman's Journal, in 1870 as a rival to Revolution.
The founder of the Women's Journal was Lucy Stone, who supported the 15th Amendment even though she too believed that women's suffrage was important.
Lucy had also tempered some of her more radical views since her own marriage and motherhood. Once a fierce advocate for divorce reform, for example, she now felt that marriage was a sacred institution that shouldn't be broken up under basically any circumstances.
This put her at odds with Elizabeth, who believed in wide divorce reform and still didn't feel that black men deserved the vote more than women did.
The two would become more entrenched in their views and would pass those on to their competing women's rights organizations, and of course they each espoused their own views while attacking the others in their respective newspapers.
Revolution, lacking advertisers, folded later in 1870 and was sold for $1. Elizabeth left Susan holding the bill for $10,000 in debt, which would take her 6 years to pay off.
What? Seriously?
Yep. Susan, being the only unmarried woman involved in the venture, was the one who had signed all of the documents and paperwork, so she was the one responsible for paying that debt.
But Elizabeth was wealthy, right? And Susan was her best friend.
Elizabeth had more money than Susan, it's true, but Susan was supporting her elderly mother and her sister on her wages, while Elizabeth was essentially supporting her entire family.
But she had that inheritance, too.
And 7 children, 6 of whom would go to college, and many of whom would have children of their own. It's possible that she was trying to make sure that they would all have some inheritance when she and Henry died, something that Susan didn't have to worry about.
That doesn't make it less of an awful thing to do to Susan, though.
No, it doesn't.
Elizabeth was more isolated than ever. She had purchased a home in Tenafly, New Jersey, away from city life, while Henry continued his life in the city as a newspaper editor. And her old friends were all joining forces against her, as demonstrated by the vitriol every time she headed a new organization or convention.
So she decided not to worry about them any longer. She spent much of the 1870s on tour as a paid lecturer, speaking about women's rights, divorce reform, and the importance of the vote.
She was still an incredibly popular speaker and always drew a crowd.
During this time, her relationship with Susan was strained. Susan was still making payments on the debt Elizabeth had saddled her with. The two friends also had a speaking tour together in 1871 that shows us Susan's first resentment of Elizabeth's popularity.
Elizabeth left early to see her mother Margaret just before Margaret's death in the same year.
And part of it was that Susan felt that Elizabeth had all of this energy to found new organizations, but none left to run them. That left Susan holding the reins and being responsible for organizing everything.
But Susan still needed Elizabeth. She stepped down from her presidency of the National Women's Suffrage Association in 1878 to elevate Elizabeth, who persuaded a senator to introduce a proposed 16th Amendment that would guarantee women the right to vote.
They granted her a new committee on women's suffrage.
She officially retired from the lecture circuit in 1879 at age 63. She was exhausted and needed time to rest up and get healthy again.
When Susan began to urge her back into her old activities, Elizabeth refused.
But she did try to vote in the election of 1880, repeating the bold act Susan had done 8 years earlier.
Unlike Susan, Elizabeth wasn't arrested. She was just prevented from putting her ballot in the ballot box.
At the end of 1880, Lucretia Mott, the abolitionist Elizabeth had first befriended in London, the woman who had first inspired Elizabeth to develop her own radical ideas, died at age 87.
This helped Elizabeth and Susan realize what their next project should be, a comprehensive history of the women's rights movement in America. So they began compiling what would eventually be the History of Women's Suffrage.
Currently, it stands at 6 volumes, published between the years 1881 and 1922.
They wrote the first 3 volumes together, with significant help from Elizabeth's activist daughter, Harriet. Elizabeth was particularly bad with dates and needed help remembering what happened when.
They gathered letters, articles, flyers, legal papers, and permissions, sewing them together into one giant quilt of shared memories of the movement.
After the publication of the second volume in 1882, Harriet convinced her mother Elizabeth to go back with her to Europe for 18 months.
Susan and Elizabeth began working on the third volume of history in 1884. Elizabeth also found time to write Frederick Douglass to congratulate him on his new marriage. It was to a white woman, so there weren't a lot of congratulations coming his way.
Elizabeth said, quote, "If a good man from Maryland sees fit to marry a disenfranchised woman from New York, full liberty of choice in such relations should be conceded," end quote.
It's possible that this might have been Elizabeth's way of apologizing, without coming out and apologizing directly, for espousing her harmful views about black men back in the late 1860s and early 1870s.
In 1885, Elizabeth, still the president of the National Women's Suffrage Association, attended the meeting in Washington. She supported a controversial resolution that condemned religion for consistently putting women in a subordinate position, as supposedly ordained by God.
Ever since her brush with revivalism, Elizabeth didn't have much appreciation for organized religion, and this resolution got her thinking about what she could do about it.
Henry, meanwhile, moved back to their Tenafly house and published a short autobiography he called Random Recollections.
Elizabeth sailed back to England in 1886 to spend more time with Harriet and her daughter Nora, where she received the news in early 1887 that Henry had died of pneumonia. He was 81.
Elizabeth spent the next several months going between Harriet's home in England and Theodore's home in France before coming back to the States in 1888.
While Elizabeth had been absent, the first vote on women's suffrage had taken place. Of the 76 senators, only 16 had voted in favor of women's right to vote.
Together, Elizabeth and Susan B. Anthony organized an International Council of Women, intended to be a universal sisterhood for feminist activists.
Elizabeth considered it a success, but was alarmed by what she saw as Susan's cozying up to the more little-c conservative religious women in the movement.
They wanted only women's suffrage, whereas Elizabeth wanted to start with women's suffrage. It was never her endgame, merely a means to a more equal end.
And women's suffrage wasn't dangerous anymore. It wasn't crazy radical thinking. It was something that plenty of respectable people were interested in now. The general feeling was that it would probably happen sooner or later.
To Elizabeth, that made it boring.
In 1890, the National and the American Women's Suffrage Associations, against Elizabeth's wishes, merged into a single entity.
The National American Women's Suffrage Association made Elizabeth its president, Susan its vice president, and Lucy Stone its executive chair.
Elizabeth ran off to England to spend time with Harriet, not particularly wanting to lead this new organization.
Elizabeth stayed away another 18 months and returned only after her eldest son Neil's death in 1891. She moved in with her children, Margaret and Robert, ignoring Susan's invitation to come live with her.
Susan did make Elizabeth go to the 1892 convention, though. It was her final public speech, and afterward she resigned as president.
The speech was called A Solitude of Self, and was Stanton's final argument for why women's rights and women's suffrage were important. Elizabeth said, quote, "Whatever the theories may be of woman's dependence on man, in the supreme moments of her life, he cannot bear her burdens. Alone she goes to the gates of death to give life to every man that is born into the world. No one can share her fears. No one can mitigate her pangs. And if her sorrow is greater than she can bear, alone she passes beyond the gates into the vast unknown." End quote. Elizabeth drew on the Protestant idea of individualism to point out that individuals, men and women alike, are ultimately each responsible for themselves and are ultimately only able to know their own needs.
For this reason, women cannot be properly served in politics by husband, fathers, or brothers representing them. Only women as individuals can understand what they want.
The speech was received with a standing ovation. 2 days later, she presented it to the Senate Committee on Women's Suffrage.
Except for Susan, all of Elizabeth's contemporaries considered it her finest work. Even Lucy Stone, the abolitionist feminist who had become Elizabeth's longtime antagonist, was so impressed with it that she published the speech in full in the Woman's Journal.
Free of her obligations to the organizations she had helped found, Elizabeth, now in her late 70s, stayed mostly at home due to her health issues.
Elizabeth's weight was such that it hampered her ability to move freely, but her mind was active as ever, and she found time to write 2 additional books.
The Woman's Bible is a 2-volume piece published in 1895 and 1898 that took aim at Christianity and its degrading views of women through reinterpretation of biblical stories.
Elizabeth had tried to summon a committee of female scholars to help her with the work, but most of the people she approached felt it wasn't an important project.
And it wasn't well received. Preachers denounced it and used it as an excuse to condemn women's suffrage as a movement.
The National American Women's Suffrage Association publicly condemned the work, saying that the views of its author were not the views of all suffragists.
In 1898, 50 years after the Seneca Falls Convention, Elizabeth published her memoirs, 80 Years and More. Her final years were spent writing a flurry of letters and articles and enjoying time with family and friends.
On October 26, 1902, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's heart failed. She died in her home at age 86.
Elizabeth had, 15 years earlier, promised her brain to the scientists at Cornell so that they could look at an intelligent woman's mind, but her children wouldn't allow it, and she was buried with her brain still in her head.
Her death was reported in most major newspapers in the United States and several in Europe. Susan died just 4 years later in 1906, neither of them living to see the passage of the 19th Amendment granting women, at long last, the right to vote.
Elizabeth said, quote, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." End quote. Unfortunately, her advocacy on behalf of women is marred by the racism, elitism, and xenophobia she exhibited throughout her writings and speeches. She was so single-mindedly committed to women's rights that she didn't care who she had to throw under the bus to get them.
But still, her work for women's rights echoes through to today. With no-fault divorce, married women's rights to their own property and wages, changes in custody laws, and of course, the participation of women in government.
She was a complicated woman and left a complicated legacy both for herself and for the movement. Elizabeth said, quote, "Such is individual life. Who, I ask you, can dare take on himself the rights, the duties, the responsibilities of another human soul?" Thank you for joining us for another episode of Historical Figures.
If you want to listen to any previous episodes of Historical Figures, you can find them on Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, Google Play, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and Spotify, or on our website, parcast.com, spelled Parcast.com. A new episode drops every Wednesday, but if you subscribe, you don't have to remember that.
If you like what you hear, please leave a 5-star review or tell us what you think on social media. We're on Facebook and Instagram as @Parcast and Twitter @Parcast Network.
It seems simple, but it really helps our show.
Again, thanks for listening. Historical Figures was created by Max Cutler. It is a production of Cutler Media and is part of the Parcast Network. It is produced by Max and Ron Cutler, sound design by Ron Shapiro and Carrie Murphy, with production assistance by Maggie Admire and Carly Madden. Historical Figures is written by Dana Shaw and stars Vanessa Richardson and Carter Roy.
Hulu has a new original show, The Looming Tower, based on the Pulitzer Prize-winning book by Lawrence Wright.
This limited series traces the rising threat of Osama bin Laden and how the rivalry between the FBI and CIA may have set a path for the tragedy of 9/11. You don't want to miss it.
The Looming Tower premieres February 28th, only on Hulu.